Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to Data Lit, a podcast for educators by educators. So I've been thinking about the role of culture in testing and for some time now. And this summer, we read a book that explored this notion. I want to read a quote from that book. Culture influences how we think, perceive, act, and communicate. Learning is mediated through culture. This means that experiences of students in a classroom might be different, even where the teaching, resources, curriculum, and relationships are the same, because how we learn and what we experience is filtered through cultural perspectives, as well as existing knowledge and experiences. So Spencer, if culture is the lens through which students learn and experience the world, how can we design assessments that are accurately measuring what they know rather than how well they fit into some sort of singular cultural mold?
Yeah, that's a great question. One we're going to explore over the next few episodes. And to me, it makes me think of, I feel like I use this metaphor a bit, but input and output. So if we need to consider culture in terms of the input, the teaching and learning, because students are not just empty vessels, that they're all the same containers and you just drop stuff in, then that also suggests that we need to consider and incorporate an own culture when we're thinking about the output when they're showing what they know.
I agree. So the book that we're talking about is titled Culturally Responsive Assessment in Classrooms and Large-Scale Contexts, edited by Carla Evans and Catherine Taylor. And this book is a collection of theory, research, best practices from some of the best scholars and professionals in educational measurement and assessment who tackle this topic and look at the intersection between culture and assessments. So one of the things I want to capture is a positionality statement that they had in their first chapter that I want to read to you guys. And they talk about where their goal as editors putting together this work is to highlight and summarize and extend the scholarship in the field of educational measurement and assessment, not to sort of talk badly about what has happened before, but sort of a call to action, if you will, for those of us in this field to kind of support the changes so that students' ways of knowing and being are reflected in large-scale and classroom assessment policies, practices, and processes. And so given that educators want to support these changes so that all students' ways of knowing are valued, how do you think we can ensure that this vision isn't just about assessments?
And this makes me think of the interrelated nature of assessment with instruction and curriculum.
Oh, yeah.
And this goes back to, I think someone we mentioned it really in our first episode, but this metaphor of thinking of education as a three-legged stool with instruction, curriculum, and assessment as part of it. And there's a good article on Edutopia that we'll drop in the show notes by Milton Chen that talks about this metaphor. And one of the things that they point out is that assessment remains the least understood of these three concepts, primarily because history and policy limit our understanding of its purposes and possibilities. I think this is interesting in many fronts with education, but particularly with culturally responsive instruction, because that's something we've looked at in different ways, as we're going to discuss throughout time, but the assessment has kind of been left off.
Yeah.
And the value of this metaphor is that with the three-legged stool, if you're missing one, it's going to fall.
Right.
And so I think what we're going to try to do is think about how does what we know about culturally responsive instruction inform how we should think about culturally responsive assessments.
Yeah.
So then let's kind of look back a little. So Mellisa, where did culture show up in the research on teaching and learning?
So I like how the book kind of talks about the early times with Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. I think it was like the mid to late 1990s, where I think that's where we first started to talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. And so that was an educational approach that emphasizes the importance of incorporating students' cultural knowledge, values, perspectives into the curriculum to create this more meaningful connection and also to empower students academically and socially. So it was this first beginning of when we're teaching, our students are more than just bodies.
Yep.
Trying to think about all of who they are.
Yeah. I think her research is really interesting, especially in contrast to how we thought about culturally responsive assessment back before that. because you can start to see some research here going back to like the 1940s and so, where there's some, perhaps an over reliance on IQ tests. And then they start to realize that like, oh, it's missing something in terms of, students, in terms of validity, in terms of it measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. And the student's culture, a student's background seems to be interfering. And editor Carla Evans of the book, which is in the show notes, pointed out an interview for Center for Assessment, which will also drop in the show notes, that I'll read a quote from that. Work in assessment, particularly the impact of human diversity, goes as far back as the 1940s. But the approach that a lot of folks used back then was, we'll just add 10 or 15 points to the scores of the people who are minorities because we know that the test is biased against them. So the idea of like knowing that something is missing, knowing that it's not quite measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, but not having a clue what to do, how to incorporate that in a meaningful, valid way. So instead, just like tinkering with the math.
Right. And I think what I like about this is another call where there's also saying or highlighting that standardized testing really hasn't changed that much.
Yeah.
And we are aware, which I think is the first sign of anything, is we are aware that there is something that is missing and we need to do something different. And so this is like a call to action of what are some things that we can be doing? What has some other researchers been saying? Where are there ways where we can have an assessment that is truly, truly measuring what students know and are able to do?
Yep, well put.
So then we went on to the late 90s, early 2000s, where they started to talk about recognizing that learning is neither culture-free nor neutral. Yeah, I like that part. And so to minimize biases and promote equitable educational opportunities for students from diverse cultural backgrounds, we again have to still do something. So again, there is still this notion of we recognize that our students are different. I love how they talk about this human diversity, right?
Yep.
So there is this human diversity in front of us. We recognize that our students are different, but it is this dilemma between standardized testing, where you have to have this one size fit all, and recognizing that all doesn't mean the same. So how do you capture some of that?
Yeah, and I like her research from this period, and that it goes from, we can't just be blind to this. We need to recognize that culture matters. But then going beyond, I think this is where too often we stop just kind of identifying and respecting a student's background to incorporating it into the instruction, the curriculum, and of course the assessment. And that's kind of the key here, I think, and where this research starts to pick up steam over the next like 15 or so years.
Yeah, and then we went into the 2000s, and I kind of remember some of this, where there was this shift from multiculturalism to this asset-based approach.
Yeah.
Like I remember when I first got to the U.S., where there was this, at least that's how I received it as an educator, where they asked us as teachers to make sure that we were incorporating our students' culture. So an example they would give us is when you are creating problems or talking about a story, try and include something like either students' names or things about who they are, where they lived, like make it more local to them. But it was interesting to see that we are shifting more than just that sort of surface level of multiculturalism and trying to get deeper into who these students are and how they're different so that we can measure that more accurately.
Yeah, it makes me think of universal designs for learning.
Yeah.
That, multiple means of representation, which I think we were starting to talk about early, and motivation, but then that third piece, expression. Multiple means to allow someone to show what they know and what they can do. And that's where I think having their background be incorporated into the assessment is key.
And then after that, I think the most recent work in teaching and learning is around Dr. Soretta Hammond's work, which sort of connects this idea of cultural responsiveness with neuroscience and what's happening in our brains. And I think that, again, highlighting how our own culture impacts our teaching and affects our learning relationships. So again, as a teacher, you recognizing, again, what are you bringing to that aspect as well as your students? So because again, we're all human beings in a class, and how all of these things are interplaying with one another makes it teaching and learning a little bit more complex. I mean, we know it's complex, but I mean, it's all of these things that are happening while we're trying to get students to learn.
Right. Yeah. Going back to if students are just an empty vessel, that kind of antiquated view of then you don't have to consider, what the vessel looks like as much.
Right.
But yeah, I like her research, and it kind of grounds it with this other field with cognitive science and starts to, we need to consider a student's amygdala, that if they don't feel safe and welcomed and comforted, then the brain is going into fight or flight mode, and it's bottlenecking everything so that students aren't able to kind of process that instruction. And then also she ties it to some of the research in terms of like the neural connections in the frontal lobe, that what education is taking new stuff and making connections to prior learning and prior experiences. And the prior learning, I think we get, but prior experiences, and that's where I think that culturally responsive comes in. If we're only allowing certain subsets of our students to make connections to their prior experiences, then they have an advantage in terms of forming those strong neural connections.
Yes, yeah. And I remember us in one of the earlier episodes, sort of talking about standardized testing was sort of measuring how well students can assimilate or fit in.
Yep.
And when we've looked at the history of standardized testing, things have changed, but not really changed. And I like how this book is asking us to consider, is that what we still want?
Yeah.
And I know most of us will say no, but if we haven't made a lot of changes in our assessments, maybe we're still doing those things. Maybe inadvertently we're trying to measure whether students can fit in, right?
Yeah. And that's, I think, that's the flaw with a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to assessment, is that it's you have to figure out what that size is going to be. So it naturally requires assimilation. But also, I think that's the flaw to assessment in the age of AI, in that if something is just that simple, then what's the point of kind of humans? And there's going to be ways to kind of fake it. Whereas I think now, for a variety of reasons, and hopefully AI kind of propels us into making these changes, we need to think about how students can bring parts of themselves into how they show what they know and what they can do.
Yeah, I like that.
Let's step back then as we think about the next couple episodes. Mellisa, why is culturally responsive assessment essential?
So one of the things that I took away about that is, again, this notion of, if our assessments are trying to make inferences about how much someone knows or is able to do, then it is imperative on us to sort of design a test that is accurately measuring that. And how do you do that when all of our students are different? And that if we don't stop to kind of at least attempt to do something different, what we might do instead is inadvertently measure their ability to navigate a test format or measure their familiarity within the cultural elements of a test, and not really get what each student knows or is able to do, and thus inadvertently adding to the achievement gaps that we already see.
Yeah, it makes, in this kind of domain of our department, it makes the assessments less valid, and it makes me think of conversations, we can drop this in the show notes, with Dr. Cizik, a psychometrician, that talked about, we've understood this for a while in terms like math. If it's kind of measuring instead their reading skills, then it's making it less valid. Same thing, if a reading test is measuring to some degree their culture, their background, then that makes it less valid. If what you want is to figure out, can they divide fractions, then all the other unrelated variables, you're trying to kind of strip those away as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you see as the essential? Like, why is this work essential?
So I'm going to cheat for this. So in reading that interview with the editors, one of them kind of answered. I was like, oh, their answer is much better than mine.
Okay, what did they say?
Yeah. Well, this is what Catherine Taylor thinks, and I'm just going to co-sign it.
Okay.
I concur at the end, is what I'll say.
Okay.
She writes in this blog that if the purpose is for kids to learn, not to label kids, but to have them learn, and that the assessment supports that learning, if we think that's what assessment is for, then we have to take into account the complexity of the students, that they are learning within a very complex context. They are bringing their backgrounds with them, but they're also creating. So it's an interaction between the children and the world in which they live.
Ooh.
Yeah, you see why I used her answer instead of mine.
Very good. Oh my gosh, I do love that answer. And I like that first part, right? She talks about if the purpose is around learning and not around labeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we inadvertently get into either the labeling of students or the labeling of teachers or the labeling of schools. And that's not really what our assessments should be about.
No, but we need to own that goal, because the fact is that a system built around labeling kids, a system built around fixed mindsets as well, is so much simpler. You just put them in a box and then they stay in that box.
Yeah.
But a system around growing kids and constantly reevaluating and reassessing, and going back to Dr. Zaretta Hammond's research, breaking down some of those preconceived notions that we set, which our brain likes to hold on to because it's a pattern-seeking machine, then we have to work much more. We have to work much harder in order to do this work.
So one of the things I think I want to sort of close with is what we do find is when our assessments are not designed to be responsive to students' individual needs, we sort of raise anxiety, frustration, a loss of motivation among students, because the students don't see themselves fitting in, right?
Yep.
They feel as though they're left out. And this can result in a sort of disengagement from learning and a belief that they're not capable of success. And as we shared at the start of the episode, if learning is mediated through culture, then a system that fails to acknowledge this can leave many students feeling like a fish being judged by its ability to climb a tree.
Yep.
And so I think what we want to do in the name of validity and reliability is to make sure that our assessments are doing what they're intended to do.
Well put.
So this is the first of 3 episodes. And so to extend our thinking on this topic of culturally responsive assessments, the next couple of episodes, we will explore this framework that is provided for educators using assessments in their classroom, as well as best practices that educators can use in their journey along this work. If you need to reach us, you can do so at datalit@wcpss.net, or you can visit our website, www.wcpss.net/datalit. And until next time, bye.
Take care.